thinking, why is it that us are being picked up so much? All right, there's a visual signifier, reason for why we were having to endure this. But what happened in that situation, in that maelstrom, was that we became energized. It wasn't like we were pushing back or pushing against something. Yes, there was a lot of commitment against racism, about the type of behavior that happened with children, with other children. But that pushback, to a certain extent, begins something in one. And I always turn back to that point in the 1970s as a time when many things shifted in my life and for many people around us. The first black people who were being killed in Britain were being acknowledged. So George Oluwala was acknowledged as being killed in Britain. That became, in a sense, a way to express and to acknowledge that death occurs through certain other forces which will not allow them to live. When artists like Rashid Arayan made the first prints to say George Oluwala had died in police conditions, that was the first time any person, as an artist, had been able to express the death of another person who was colored or black or Asian. Those names, those faces, those acts started to have a space within British art history. Even British art history didn't want to acknowledge it, but here it was as part of British art history. So what I want to say, and what I'm stirring and trying to get to, is that when one occupies a cultural or a political position, or tries to understand how to occupy and practice a political art position, or an artist who comes from a political position, it's a difficult one. You're not necessarily always right, but you know what is wrong. And you try to face that wrong path. Since the 1980s, when I graduated at art school, I graduated with a very specific artistic community in an art school. Because even within the art school, there was an incredible amount of differences which were being mediated. Art school itself is a very specific institutional space through which Western discourse and canon making feeds society. We came out at a time when we had realized that we were not safe within our school, outside in society, nor within our homes. The 1970s and early 80s in Britain were when petrol bombs used to be dropped through letterbox into our houses. I'd left East Africa with people outside our houses with torches at night burning and really claiming land, because we were seen as the middle ground, Asians as the middle ground. So escaping Africa and coming to Europe wasn't easy. So when I see what's going on at the moment, it's not easy to see it, because it's just a continuation of what happened then. So my practice, my artistic career, my community flourished within the political realities of that time. We came up with something which was called the political black art movement. And you might have recently seen Sonia Boyce win the award in Venice. Simone Yvette Lee winning the pavilion for America. That's part of a political black art movement. They're separate from the American one, but it has strands that stretches between those two continents. What happened in Britain, that people had come from Africa, people had come from Asia, people had come from the Caribbean, all of a sudden they had to find a way to negotiate being in Britain, being together. It's not as if they spoke the same language, ate the same food, or dressed each other the same way, or even believed in the same religion. None of that was there, yet they were pushed so much to the side that they found themselves against the wall trying to work out how do we make some form of solidarity. Solidarity translates to a large extent in when we build up a sense of ourselves through an agency, when we don't derelict our duties, when we don't say, we're not going to do that because it's too difficult, we're not going to do that because it's too offensive. We had to do it. We had to go into the streets. In the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, a lot of very young people were being killed in Britain. A lot of very young African and Asian people were just killed. They would have a party and somebody would throw a bomb, the police would do nothing, and there was never any sort of outcome to those events. At one particular party, 14 young black people died in a fire, which they didn't start. There were 2 very large police interventions into what should happen. There's an investigation that were inconclusive. At that time, around 40,000 black people walked across Britain to say, we will not take this back. We will not take on this as part of our burden. We are here because you wanted us here. You gave us British passports in the Caribbean, in East Africa, in India. Now we come as British subjects. All we have is to combat the racial prejudice and violence which is inflicted on us. That sense of agency that comes out of threat, out of fear, out of condemnation is what made political black art important. Not important to Britain, because Britain never acknowledged it. It's only now acknowledging it, 40-odd years later. It's taken 40 years for any of those artists to receive even group shows at the Tate and places like that. Those artists who came out, like in my generation, graduating in 79, 81, 83, are now beginning to get grants and possibly even awards. So it's been 40 years of waiting, 40 years of working in lower paid jobs, 40 years of waiting for exhibitions and curators and collections and national heritage to come to it and say, this is important, this was a great intervention, you did a good job. Those artists have remained hidden, submerged, out of the narrative. There's a genealogy of curating which we have to address, because curating itself is something very specific. And there's a genealogy of black curating that's also come out, which we have to address. Some of the most important exhibitions which have been made recently are coming out of those communities, have certain types of practices which they're built on, which are not necessarily found everywhere, but neither are they accessible. Sometimes they're deliberately blocked. And I work from such fragments of the archive. We build up those archives from those fragments. Because archives, more or less, are always fragments. But fragments within fragments is a sort of double bind that we work with. That's why I call myself an independent curator, because I'm not tied to an institutional framework or its norms or how it creates ascendancy. I'm, what I would suggest, am interested in what is missing rather than what is there. Because what is there has been there because it has been led by a sense of prejudice, a sense of bias, and a sense of racial division. What we do within that black art community, that political black art community, is a more nuanced approach, both to curating and to archiving. What I suggest has happened to a large extent is not knowing how we curate, but we know why we curate. And this is not only about colonization or colonialism. Our interests lie in the notion of inequalities. They exist in society, they're endemic in society, and they are not only in Western society, they're also in Eastern or Southern world societies. Caste is not something that was part of colonialism, but colonialism took advantage of the fact that caste existed. Gender problems were not part of colonialism, but colonialism took advantage of the fact that gender problems and realities existed in those spaces. So let them carry on so that we can now carry on policing the upper echelons. So, as Barbara said, I've been making exhibitions since 1983. But not only exhibitions, conversations. I've been addressing the notion of syllabus. And my ambition in all of those activities is to create a unique vantage point. And I'll deliberate on this a bit longer. Again, we go back to that idea. How do you create a unique vantage point? The great poet Audre Lorde said, again, it is a slightly different way of putting it, not only what we are doing, but we are aware of what we're doing.